Everyone, welcome back. This week we've been taking a look at analyzing art and knowing the different techniques and strategies that artists use in order to create meaning. This lecture is going to take a look at medium in the visual arts and how different mediums actually produce different techniques, different styles, and are important to note as we're analyzing art. It's important to know what the medium is. This particular lecture is going to be based on the terminology that I put online. So this is the document that's on Canvas, so you can download this and follow along. I'll be giving you some definitions that you might see in the future on, say, the next test. But it's important to know these ideas, not just, to fill your life with meaningless words or ideas, but so you can develop a language, right? We talked about last time the importance of developing a language so that we can come together and have a discussion and talk about things, and so people can know what we're referring to and have a common reference point. Taking a look at the first term that I want you to be aware of, and that's really what's going to structure this particular lecture here, is medium, right? When we refer to medium within the arts, we're referring to what the work of art is made of, right? So that medium, for instance, as you see with Albrecht Dürer's here, self-portrait, the medium of that one is its visual arts. It's more specific to that would be oil. As we see with Michelangelo's Dying Slave, that the medium there is marble. And then we have Albrecht Dürer's Praying Hands, which the medium there is, it's a print, it's ink. And so the medium is just really what makes up a particular object, right? And so, but the medium also can transcend beyond the visual arts. It could be the medium of literature. The medium could be film. So medium is just whatever the artist is choosing to use to convey his or her message, right? So that's what we're referring to. Today we're going to be taking a look at the visual arts, and throughout this semester we'll then be taking a look at other mediums that are out there with literature, music, film, drama, etc., right? So let's take a look at painting. Painting, definition for painting is the process of applying pigment to a surface. Usually the surface is going to be a canvas or a wall or a ceiling, right? So painting is just the process of applying pigment to a surface, right? That's in its basic sense. So then the question is, right, the follow-up question is, what is pigment? Pigment is the source of color for the paints, and so pigment is just whatever color that you're using. It used to be more natural elements in the old days. It used to be natural elements like plants or kind of particles from animals. But today, most pigments are synthetic, coming from chemicals, oil, things like that, that create the pigments for today. The vehicle, it's important to know the vehicle and the pigment, and important to know the medium as we go through this, because different elements have different benefits and has different disadvantages, right? So there's pros and cons to each of them. We'll take a look at those. The vehicle, it's also known as a binder, is the agent that's used to adhere the pigment to the surface, right? So generally in the old days, pigment would be, taking a plant and kind of grinding it up, and then you'd have like a powder. But if you just to throw that powder on a piece of paper and you lift that piece of paper up, the powder would just fall off, right? So they need something to make it sticky, right? To be adhesive, and that is the vehicle, right? And so there's three main types of vehicles that are out there, right? Types of vehicles are water. Again, there's pros and cons to them. Water is awesome because it is ubiquitous. It's easy to find, so you can always turn to it to be able to create your work of art. But it does have some drawbacks to it, right? So one of the drawbacks to water, I mean, this is generally what we give to kindergartners to paint. We would say go paint. We generally give them watercolors, and then we give them like a little cup, and they put their brush inside the cup, and then they swirl it around on the pigment, and then they start to paint. But what happens, right? Generally, what they give children is, some computer paper or something like that. and then it just kind of soaks right through. So one of the problems with water is you need some really absorbent surface in order to be able to take the water and to be able to absorb that. Another negative of watercolor is once you touch that to the surface, that color is now part of the surface. There's no going back to it, right? Because it's actually inside the surface. Rather than saying on the top of the surface, it actually absorbs into the surface. So that means once you make a line, that line is there. And so if you mess up, you kind of have to start over. The watercolor that I show you here, this is an Albrecht Dürer image from 1502. And this is a hare, right? Dürer's hare, or a rabbit. And you can notice, I mean, if you look closely at it, you can see that each stroke, right? So each stroke that he put on there, he had to make sure that he wanted to do that because there's no going back. But you can get pretty precise. You can get pretty detailed with it. And once you're done, you're just kind of done with it. But if you look at how detailed this particular image is, if you look at the eye, right, the pupil of the eye, you can see a window that's behind the artist, Albrecht Dürer, that's reflecting in the eye of the bunny. So you can get really detailed with that. But again, it's a little bit tricky. You have to have the right kind of material that you're using, and you have to be very cautious about what type or your lines that you are using. But one way to know that something is a watercolor is if you get up really close and it looks like a water stain, or it looks like it's kind of absorbed into the surface. You'll know it's a watercolor. And there's a lot of good watercolors. There's a lot of really good original art on campus. And so if you are in Rexburg and on campus, I highly recommend you just kind of walk through some of the buildings and take a look around. There's actually a fairly substantial budget that the university has each year to go out and actually buy original art. So the university has this vested interest in making sure that the educational environment that you're studying in is creative and produces, these kind of inspirational elements of beauty and art that we've been taking a look at. And so take a look, and as we go through some of these types of paintings, I want you to see if you can identify one. And if we're meeting face to face, what I generally do is I have you guys go on a scavenger hunt and to find different types of medium that are around campus, which is really fun. But since some of you will not be on campus and away from Rexburg, we'll just have to do something a little bit differently this semester. Tempera is another vehicle, and what this is made is from egg yolk, right? So in some ways, a negative is that it's not as easy to find an egg, although it is fairly easy, but it's not as readily available to people as water. But it can stick to any type of surface, and so you don't necessarily need that super absorbent kind of material. It can pretty much stick to anything. This one, Duccio's Madonna and Child, is a tempera, and what we see here is you can stick tempera on wood. I think this one is on wood, and so you could just take a piece of wood and use the tempera in order to create your image. And so it sticks on pretty much anything. In the old days, they used to use tempera a lot. They would put it on wood. They would put it on walls as a mural, or they put it on ceilings. So it'd actually be quite common. One of the downsides, though, of tempera is it generally has more of a muted color to it. As you take a look at temperas, you can pretty much tell that they're tempera just because they're going to have that kind of golden hue to it. And they're going to be a little bit darker, and they're not going to be quite as vibrant. And so not quite the versatility in colors that you get with other mediums. But again, it's still pretty accessible. Taking a look at oil, that's the next vehicle that I just wanted to talk about briefly. Oils were developed in the 1400s. And they started saying, "Hey, let's find a different vehicle." And what they found with oils, it gives them a wide range of color choices. As you see here with Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait, you can see the vibrant colors, the vibrant green and the blue, and then the reds, which is very different from the muted colors of tempera. And so this just opened up the world to artists. And if you take a look at this one, just again to show you some of the colors and the versatility. It's mainly the oil used to be used from linseed oil, and so I just give you a picture on the bottom of that. But if you take a look at the back, this is just a detail of this image right here. You take a look at the rosary beads, right? That's, we have the sunlight coming in from the window and we can see the sun glistening through it. So it gives the sense that there's this translucence of these rosary beads that you can actually see through them. Or the mirror here, you can see this is a reflection of his back and her back right here, and then a person, right? Could be the artist standing right in the middle. And then on the very back, you have the artist signing his work. Jan van Eyck was here. But again, you can see the amount of detail and versatility that oil's given. So generally, the art world gravitated towards oil because of this versatility. So one of the downsides, and this is just a close-up of the chandelier again, you can see the reflection of the sun coming in from the window on the chandelier. So wide range of colors that you can use, and you couldn't really do this unless you had that versatility of colors. And you can change, the colors subtly in order to give it a slightly different look to it to represent, right, the sun shining through. One of the negatives of oil is it generally takes a lot longer to dry, right? So if you hit, using watercolor or something, it dries pretty quickly. Tempera dries fairly quickly. But oil generally it could take like a couple of days, depending on how much oil is on the canvas, to really dry and to be more permanent. But in a way, that's actually a positive, because if an artist makes a mistake, he or she can go back and the next day and kind of just kind of scrape off what the mistake was, and then add to it. And so in some ways it's a positive, in some ways it's a negative. And so again, this is just another detail of the image. And then this is me standing next to it. This is actually in the National Gallery in London, and so it gives you a sense of the size. I mean, with all of these little tiny details, you would think that this painting would be ginormous, but it's actually quite small. It's just a little bit bigger than maybe a hymn book or two. Not very big at all. But again, as an artist is thinking about which vehicle to use, he or she has to make these considerations. In what way? What are some of the limitations of each of them, and how do I really want to create my image? More in the 20th century, we have now a lot of artists gravitating towards acrylics. Developed in the 1930s, it was less expensive and dries quicker than oils, and so here you see the difference between an acrylic versus an oil, giving you a slightly, I don't know, the oil still has a little bit more, in my mind, a little more detail, a little more kind of sense of realism. But acrylics are a little bit more easily accessible due to their lower cost. Taking a look at walls and ceilings, right? A fresco, what they do with a fresco, generally the term means fresh, right? It's Italian for fresh, and so think about that in your mind. But what they do is they lay down a fresh plaster on the wall, just a thin layer of plaster. And then they'll take what is called a cartoon or an image, a drawing that they have holes in. So think about a jack-o'-lantern that you're making for Halloween, right? They have kind of holes in it that you kind of trace out, and then you go through and then you cut out your image. Similar to that, right? So they have little holes in they create a cartoon and an image that they're the drawing, and then they're going to transfer that drawing onto the wet plaster. And so they have little holes in it. And then they take little, like a little chalk bag, and then they hit the outside of the drawing, and then when they peel it back, the coal will go inside the holes of what that you place on the drawing, and then so you'll have kind of an outline for that. And I wanted to show you the process. This is Michelangelo's process of a fresco.
His basic approach was a standard technique called buon fresco, which is still taught at places like this international conservation organization in Rome. The chief conservator is Paul Schwarzbaum, now with the Guggenheim Museum. He explains what has been learned from the restoration about Michelangelo's technique.
We're going to try and make a reproduction, if you will, to recreate the working technique of Michelangelo, the way he painted the frescoes of the Sistine ceiling. We're going to use the same materials, and we're going to try as best we can we're not Michelangelo, but to recreate his working technique. The materials that you see on the floor, we know from analysis, these are the materials that Michelangelo used to make his plaster.
The plaster is made from lime, water, and a brown volcanic ash called pozzolana. These are mixed into a smooth violet-colored paste. The plaster is applied to a surface prepared the day before called the oricio. This fresh wet layer, the intonaco, is applied just before painting.
The word fresco in Italian means fresh. And what it means is that we're painting on the fresh plaster. The painter was obliged to work before the plaster dried. Now, this means that the plaster could only be applied little by little as the painter worked in terms of what he thought he might finish in a day or before lunch or what have you. There's a word in Italian which is called the giornata. We know from the cleaning of the Sistina that the colors there are very, very bright, and Michelangelo wanted these bright colors. To do that, we see that in certain areas he put on, at the very end, just before he painted, a very bright white, more white, let's say, very, very, very thin layer of preparation, but very rich in lime. Very thin. It would be a millimeter or two thick, what he's putting on now. Like a sheet of paper.
After the plaster is applied,
here's the
design
cartoon.
is transferred using cartoons, drawings on paper. The contours of the figure are incised into the wet plaster, sometimes using a piece of wood. A different technique is used to outline the details around the face.
The other technique is called spolvero in Italian, and probably called a pouncing technique in English. We make a series of small holes along the lines in certain very key points. Michelangelo, we see, did the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the ears, the throat, and then takes a little sack of charcoal or some powdered pigment, and then you'll see the pigment goes through the holes and leaves the design on the fresco. So he has something to use as a guide for painting. Okay, let's take it off. You see, that would be how Michelangelo transferred his design. And with that, it gives you a base for painting.
Michelangelo mixed ground pigments with water. He used just 7 colors derived from minerals found in earthen clays. For his greens, he used green earth, ochres for his yellows and reds, and cobalt or lapis lazuli for the blues. When Michelangelo applied the colors to the wall, they had a translucent quality, like watercolor. But as the plaster dried, a process called carbonation took place. Carbon dioxide in the air combined with the lime in the plaster to form a hardened rock-like surface of calcium carbonate. As a result of this process, the pigment particles were cemented in place, becoming a part of the wall.
Standard fresco technique is a rather stable technique. When it's done well, it lasts thousands of years. We have Roman frescoes that are close to 2,000 years old.
But did Michelangelo vary the standard technique in any way, embellish it perhaps by adding any other layers of paint or glue varnish to the surface of the fresco? Unfortunately, there is no complete record of Michelangelo's working technique. In letters to his family, he did write about painting the chapel, but he mostly complained of the uncomfortable working conditions. In front, my skin grows loose and long. My head is bent back on my shoulders, and my paintbrush drips a rich mosaic onto my face.
Poor Michelangelo. He complained about doing the Sistine Chapel the entire time, the entire 4 years it took him. he complained he didn't want to do it at all. And so it's kind of ironic that that's the one thing that we remember him for. But some of the positives for fresco, one of the positives is it's going to last a long time, right? You don't have to worry about it deteriorating because of the vehicle, the paint, and the plaster coming together and hardening together. They actually seal, and so it becomes extremely durable over the years. And as the individual in the video mentioned, that there are Roman frescoes that are thousands of years old that are actually in really good shape. I got to see some a couple of years ago when I went through an old Roman ruin that were just kind of on the walls, kind of that they were just homes that were built for the Romans, and they were just there in very good shape. I mean, the rest of the house is fallen, but the walls that had the frescoes, you could still see the frescoes, and it was actually really cool to be able to see that. But the negative, right, the downside of a fresco is that it's an extremely laborious, painstaking process. If any of you have worked in drywall and worked with putting plaster on the wall or trying to hide those seams of the drywall coming together, it's a pain. It's a painstaking process to put plaster on a wall, and then you can only do as much as you can do for the day. And if you make a mistake, right, you come back, you can't really go back over it. You have to take like a chisel or something to get off the wall. And so for the most part, this is going to be a very stable thing if you do it, but it's going to be very painstaking. And so most people will generally go towards murals instead. And mural, rather than the fresco, which is painting on a wet surface in order to wait for it to get it to harden and then become part of the surface, what we see with a mural is that they actually paint on a dry surface, right? So the positive for that, painting on a dry surface, as we see here with Leonardo's Last Supper, which rather than using watercolors that Michelangelo used, he used more tempera colors within this one. But again, the idea is here is he's painting on a wall. But the difference here is painting on a dry surface is the pigments don't adhere to the surface as well. And so over time, they can actually start to peel and to flake. And that's what we see with Leonardo's Last Supper. As you see here, the detail of the face of Christ, or this apostle over here, you can see the amount of pigment that's just kind of flaked off over the years. And it was even starting to fall apart in Leonardo's own lifetime. And it started falling apart to a point where about 100 or 200 years later, they actually decided to put a door in here in the wall, right by Christ's feet. They just decided, you know what, this is so dilapidated anyway, who cares that Leonardo made this? We'll just put a wall in here because we need one, right? So it was just so, deteriorated over time, and now they're restoring it. They're finding a way to try to restore it. But then again, the question is, do we restore something that Leonardo does? Because if we're restoring it, that means we're going to be covering up some of what he's done. We might be changing some of it. And so it's a pretty heated debate within the art world about what should we restore and how we should restore it. And then the last one I wanted to take a look at was a mosaic. A mosaic is applying small pieces of glass or stone or other materials like ceramics to a surface, usually a floor or a wall or ceiling. And so in some ways it's kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. You take little pieces, different colors, and you piece them together to make it look like an image. And so again, this is pretty stable because you're kind of cementing them in place. So it'll, generally, if you do it right, the mosaics can last a long time. But again, it's a painstaking process, as you can imagine, trying to chip and to cut each specific piece. And so there's some benefits to it, and there's a downside to it as well. And then let's take a look at printing. Printing is a way of, before we had the internet and photographs, it was a way to mass produce an image. And so if you wanted to get your image out there more, you would generally use the printing process. Because if you're just using paint, you have that one image that you created, that one painting, but then, how many people can really see that, right? So few can see it. But if you want your message to get across to a large group of people, you started using printing. So I wanted to take a look at different types of print, right? So the definition of print is the process of reproducing art to make it more accessible to people, right? A woodcut is using wood as the process, right? So kind of scraping your image into a piece of wood and then inking the wood and then like a stamp, right? Kind of transferring it to a piece of paper. And some of the pros for a wood is that wood's generally softer than metal. That's the other methods that are used. So it's easier to carve it in there, carve your negative image, because you have to carve your negative image because whatever is deep down, right, that's going to be where the ink goes and then transfers over. But the negative of woodcuts is that it's going to be less durable, and so it's not going to stand up to as many inkings or as many prints that you have. And engraving is taking a sharp tool and carving your image. Usually, it's on copper and onto metal. Carving taking a sharp tool and then carving an image onto metal, usually copper. Then inking the metal to make an imprint, right? So the pros here is you can have more detail than you can have with woodcuts. And it's less fuzzy than etchings, but the con is it's really tricky to scrape away all that metal, so it's more of a painstaking process. And etching is using wax, and so it's taking that metal plate and then putting a thin layer of wax on it, and then carving your image into the wax, and then dropping that metal sheet into some acid. And then the acid eats away and carves your image in. I want to show you that process of how they do that, just so you can get a sense of how the process is done.
You start the etching process by selecting one of three etching metals, which are copper, zinc and steel, which all have very different kinds of characteristics. We're starting this etching with a piece of copper, which then has to be polished and then degreased before a wax ground, which is acid resistant, can be applied to the plate. And once that's been done, the plate is then smoked with some lighting tapers, which impart a much darker surface to the wax, which allow you to get much greater contrast when you're making a drawing. There are a range of very, very different types of techniques which you can use to get your image onto the plate, and there have been many technical innovations since the age of Rembrandt. But essentially what we're doing today is a hard ground etching, which is strictly linear. And to make the line drawing, there are a range of different points and scribes which you can use to get different kinds of lines. And I'll be using a very straightforward tool which is called diamond point, because it's a particular hard tip, and it'll ensure that with a very even pressure I can clear all the ground off when I'm making the drawing. After the drawing's been made, it's then immersed in acid, and the longer you leave the plate in the acid, the deeper it bites and the wider the line gets. So the longer you leave it, the darker, the wider line that's printed. So for a very fine line, you might only leave the plate in the acid for a minute, maybe 30 seconds. For very dark, thick lines, you might have the plate immersed in the acid for hours, if necessary, to get the right width. And the plate can be stopped out using an acid-resistant varnish at any time to keep lines at a certain depth. Once the plate's been bitten, the next stage is to proof the plate, is to take the first print and see exactly what you've got before you make any further decisions. If you're very, very lucky and the plate works first time, then that's the magic of print. But most often one goes back and removes lines and scrapes lines out, repolishes the plate, or even, in my own case, quite often abandon the plate at that stage and move on to the next plate.
So Right, it's just one other way of transferring an image to be able to mass produce. And once you have your plate, you can just ink it, repeatedly to continually produce your work of art. Generally, one way to know whether something is a print or not is going to be that there's going to be a number on the bottom, right? The artist will sign each one of them, right? So there's a piece of paper that comes out of the print. They'll sign each piece of paper, and then they'll put like a number on it. So they'll be like 91/ out of 100, right? So this is the 91st printing out of that 100 that were printed, and so it just gives you a sense of where it was at and how many were made. And of course, how many were made is going to depend upon how much it's worth, right? So the more prints that are out there, the less it is actually worth overall, right? Because it's just the saturation of the market, supply and demand. And also it depends upon, the value depends upon which print it was. Was this the first printing? Was this the 10th printing? Did the artist actually print it? Or did we find the plate 100 years later and then decide to print afterwards, right? So that all factors into the actual value. Lithograph is another printing process. Litho means stone, right? And graph is just a way of writing, right? So it literally translates to stone writing. But what they do is they use oil. They draw an image with an oil crayon onto the surface of a stone, and then they use acid in order to carve the image. And I just wanted to show you that process as well, because these are some things that we're not necessarily familiar with and outside the humanities and the arts.
This introduction to lithography will show the artist's drawing process, materials that are used on drawing a lithographic stone, the process of printing, and the details and subtlety that can be achieved in the printing process, as well as a close-up look at prints themselves. Lithography, or stone printing, is an intricate printmaking process that revolves around grease and water resisting one another. An artist will draw with a greasy material on a lithographic stone. Once we've established a drawing or grease on the stone, we chemically treat the stone with materials like gum arabic to establish the areas where water goes, rosin and talc to help us through what we call an etch, or it's basically to establish the drawing down inside the stone. Once the grease is pulled into the stone, we can replace the drawing material with any colored greasy ink that we would like. The basic drawing materials that we use from a historic standpoint are things like litho pencils, and it's pencil when it's in this sort of format. So the lower the number, or the greasier and waxier that material is. So if you want a fine, hard line, you'd use a higher number because that's a harder material. Lithographic crayons are in this format. So the surface of a litho crayon is such that you can use it for rubbing or for a fine line, and it can be shaped also to fit your needs. And they come in varying sizes and hardnesses as well. The surface of a lithographic stone is a very seductive surface to draw on. It's responsive and it's also sculptural. Because the stone in and of itself is receptive to water, so if I dampen the stone, it absorbs the water. And it's also receptive to grease, which means it will suck the grease down in. It allows me to put drawing material down and then remove it with things like razor blades, an X-Acto knife, sandpaper. So it allows you to draw in a more sculptural way rather than having the limitations of a piece of paper. This is a lithographic stone with a drawing by artist Steve Johnson on it. It was a drawing done with a lithographic crayon directly on the surface of the stone. This stone is made from limestone. It is completely open, as we call it, which means it's receptive to grease and water at this stage. So if I were to put my thumbs on the surface of the stone, that would become image area because of the grease from my skin. So it's a fairly delicate drawing surface from that standpoint, but it's also a positive in the sense that every fine mark that you can put down with a greasy material will hold in that fidelity. So in this process, it's what's called a first etch. And right after that, we will remove the drawing material and apply printing ink to it, which is what's called proving the stone. So now the drawing material has a small amount of talc and rosin attached to it, and it's ready to be etched. So we first apply the gum arabic to the stone, and this is to start to establish the non-image area of the stone. So what we're trying to make sure is that the whites of the stone stay that way, and they receive gum arabic, which will help them receive water later on. Once the stone has begun to receive the gum into it, we can apply the acidified gum arabic, in this case, which is taperum. That acidification with tannic acid helps keep that gum arabic permanently bonded to the stone. I'm also being very gentle at this point as to not scrub or disturb the drawing material that's on the stone. Once I've etched the stone, I'll remove some of that material and replace it with fresh gum arabic. This is what we call cooling the stone down. It's basically reducing the quantity of acid on the surface of the stone, so that when we buff in the gum arabic into a very thin and even sheet, we don't run the risk of having too much acid remaining on the stone. We use cheesecloths to buff this in very evenly. Next, we'll be washing this drawing material out with lithotripsine. It's a greasy solvent, which is a refined turpentine made especially for lithography. The drawing material will be replaced with asphaltum, which has also been thinned with lithotripsine, to create a greasy, very ink-receptive base for the ink on the roller to replace it with. At this point, your drawing will disappear. It's not actually gone, and what you can see is a residue, or a ghost image as we call it, there on the surface of the stone. That is where the stone has been converted to soap, or oleomanganate of lime. Right now, when we buff the asphaltum down onto this, we're going to replace that drawing material, which is, in effect, grease sticking to grease. So it's the grease-loving area of the stone, or the oleophilic area of the stone, accepting new grease. When a stone has been etched properly, you'll be able to see a fairly clear ghost image on the surface of the stone. What will be happening next is that we are going to wet the surface of the stone. I will go over it with a wet towel, then a dry towel. Kate will sponge that surface, and I will apply ink immediately to the stone, and that will bring up our image. In the beginning, we're not actually interested in transferring ink to paper. We're actually more interested in forcing ink into the stone so that it can start to fill up the greasy reservoir where it was. Yeah, go ahead, Nancy. So you can see only a very small amount of ink has actually been transferred because we're starting to push ink into the stone first. It's an average of 4 to 6 newsprints for any given particular stone to come up to a full inking. So when printing on a dampened sheet of paper, we can achieve a different tonal range based on the softness of that paper. What we want to do is match that movement and flow of the hand. So what I'm looking for when I look at this is to see if it feels as if a hand has moved across that surface with the drawing material. And if it has, and if it maintains that character, then we consider that a good impression.
So what I'm hoping to accomplish by showing you, these videos and talking about this is to help you develop a greater appreciation for the arts by knowing how they're made, right? Knowing how they're made helps us to understand the construction process, to see through the lens of an artist, and how an artist creates something and sees through the world. Now, the other question, that I get often as we go through the prints is, how do I know whether something is a woodcut, an engraving, an etching, or a lithograph? And my response to that is, I don't know, right? I mean, unless it says. A lot of times there'll be a nameplate by it, and they'll say it's a lithograph, or a seriograph, or an etching, or engraving, or whatever. But if you're just looking at a sheet of paper, you're not going to know what the original source was, right? Because it was all part of the process of just transferring ink to the piece of paper. And so there really is no, I don't know, maybe some really trained people can tell, but it'd be really difficult because all you're looking at is the product of it rather than the actual image. All right, let's leave off with sculpture, or what is known as three-dimensional art. One element of sculpture is what is known as subtraction. So Subtraction is one type of sculpture. Subtraction is the process of carving an image out of stone, usually marble. And so you're subtracting, right, the amount of material that you're using in order to reveal the space that's underneath it. And so Michelangelo's David is a good example of subtraction, right? The idea of removing the marble in order to reveal the image of David. Casting is another way. Casting, as you see here, this is another. What casting is you take two pieces of generally clay, and you carve the negative image inside that, inside one side, right, the front side, and then the back side of the image, and then you put those two pieces of of dried clay together, and you create a mold. Right, so it's just essentially you're just trying to create a mold. So think like Jello or something like that, where you're just creating a mold, and then you pour molten metal, right, generally bronze, inside the clay, and then you wait for it to harden, and then you remove, the clay molds, and then you should have your revealed image underneath. And so. In a way, right, the positives of using casting is because you're using metal, then you can pretty much do any shape and any image that you really want. Whereas the negative of subtraction is you have to worry about the weight of the actual marble, right? So I think chapter 4 talks about the ankles of Michelangelo's David. Not being able to support the rest of, his legs, his torso, his head, right, just because of the weight of the marble. And so Michelangelo had to use this little branch or tree trunk here in order to disguise, right, another element that's being able to support the amount of marble. You don't really have to worry about that with metal, right? You just have to pour it in there, and then pretty much the metal's going to be able to support itself. Generally, the image is going to be hollow, right? So generally, the casting isn't necessarily going to be solid. It's going to be a hollow image, and you'll just kind of see the outside shell. But the negative of a casting is is the actual process of creating the actual clay, right? So the actual clay molds. Because what happens is you carve your image into the clay, and then you wait for it to harden as you're creating your mold. If there are any holes or air bubbles inside that mold, the clay will crack during the process, and then you have to start all over again. And so it's actually a kind of a painstaking, laborious process. Michelangelo is rumored to have gone to the Pope every time he didn't really like to use casting a lot, but every time he did, he would go to the Pope for a blessing that his molds would hold out. And so in some ways, there's a negative to that. But the other positive of a casting is once you have the molds, just like a print, you can continue to, create another one and another one, right? So you can kind of mass produce them. A lot of artists didn't do that. A lot of artists would destroy the molds afterwards in order to make their, image more valuable. But some, like Rodin, who did the Thinker, right? He did like 27 of them, and so they're kind of littered throughout, the U.S. and Europe. His variations of the Thinker. Terracotta is, you see the image on the bottom. Terracotta is a sculpture out of clay, right? That's hardened. So the positive is, working with clay is generally fairly easy. But the negative is, and then you just kind of wait for it to dry. But the negative is, if you drop it, it's not all that durable. So you have to be really careful with it. A relief is a type of a sculpture. A relief is when the sculpture is attached to the background. So this would be like, I think chapter 4 talks about if you take out a coin from your pocket, right? That's going to be a relief, right? So this terracotta here would be a low relief, right? So it's attached to the background. A high relief would be when a sculpture is not attached to the background, but a person cannot walk around the entire work. And so And it's designed to be that way. It's designed for you to only be able to see it from, one particular side, right, rather than the entire image. But a full round is a sculpture that is intended to be viewed from 360 degrees, right? So you can walk around the entire thing and get a sense of what it's like. And so with that in mind, right, a kind of a last kind of quiz here to kind of think about the sculpture as we think about these three images that come from the United States, right? Mount Rushmore in South Dakota, or the Lincoln Memorial in D.C., or Benjamin Franklin statue in Philadelphia. I want you to think about what types are these, right? So if you think about Mount Rushmore, is this a low relief, is it a high relief, or is it a full round, right? As you think about Lincoln, is this a low relief, a high relief, or full round? And as we think about Benjamin Franklin, right? Was this a high relief, a low relief, or a full round? And so, again, this is just to get you a sense of what different types of art is out there. How do artists create them? What's the process of creating them to give us a little bit better appreciation for that? Some of the pros and cons of each one, some of the limitations and benefits of each one. And then what I would like you to do with this is I want you to start paying attention to, as you develop your own language and your own terminology, to start paying attention to saying, hey, what is this? Let me look a little bit deeper and understand what's actually happening. And hopefully that'll give you a deeper appreciation for the arts for years to come.